I was sitting in the back of a local town hall meeting last Tuesday, watching a group of people argue over a crumbling historical library. One young guy, clutching a stack of flyers, was practically breathless as he spoke. He wasn't interested in fixing the roof or replacing the windows. He wanted the whole thing leveled. "The structure is rotten to the core," he said with a strange, giddy intensity. To him, the only way forward was to wipe the slate clean and build something entirely new. He wasn't looking at a building. He was looking at a symbol that needed to be erased. But then an older woman stood up, her voice trembling not with excitement, but with a sharp, cold indignation. She didn't want a new building, and she didn't even want the library as it stood. She pulled out a grainy black and white photo from the 1920s. "We need to go back to this," she insisted, pointing at a version of the town that had long since vanished. To her, every improvement made in the last 50 years was just another layer of decay. What was fascinating wasn't just their disagreement, but the visceral reaction they both had toward the person in the middle, a contractor who was simply trying to suggest a modern HVAC upgrade. The revolutionary called him a spineless sellout for trying to patch up a dead system, while the traditionalist accused him of destroying the soul of the past. That moment of total deadlock, where the person trying to actually fix things becomes the common enemy, left me thinking. We use words like left, right, radical, and reactionary every day in our comment sections, but we rarely stop to look at the invisible architecture behind them. We're all standing on a massive political spectrum, a sliding scale that determines whether we see the world as a project to be finished, a mistake to be corrected, or a treasure to be guarded at all costs. To understand where we are going, we first have to understand where we are standing on this map.
That is, it's such a vivid picture. It's a perfect little diorama of our entire political moment, isn't it?
It felt like it. The air was just electric.
And that poor contractor, just trying to talk about ductwork, he becomes the one person everyone can agree to hate. That deadlock, as you called it, that's not an accident. It's not just a local squabble. It feels like the defining feature of, well, everything right now.
Exactly. It feels like the ground itself is unstable. Like the maps we used to use to find our way around politically and socially, they just don't work anymore. The landmarks are gone.
The center isn't where it used to be. Or maybe it's not there at all.
And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive. I want to get past the day-to-day headlines, the polls, the tax debates. I want to look at that invisible architecture. Why does the ground feel so shaky? Why does that middle space seem to be, physically vanishing?
And why does everyone seem so absolutely 100% certain that their map is the only correct one?
Right. The certainty is almost the most frightening part.
Well, to try and answer that, we've pulled together some pretty serious research. This isn't just a collection of hot takes. We're going to be drawing on foundational sociology Emil Durkheim, writing over a century ago about things that feel like they were written yesterday.
And we've got some very modern tools, too. There's some fascinating agent-based modeling, computer simulations that, try to explain how our online lives are literally reshaping our social structures.
We'll also bring in some crucial cultural analysis from Christopher Lasch on things like narcissism and what he called the therapeutic state. And finally, some pretty sobering case studies on what happens when all of that social glue just completely dissolves.
So the mission here is to map this breakdown, to understand the collapse of the center and maybe the rise of this intense, unshakable certainty at the edges.
A kind of political cartography for a world that feels like it's falling off the map.
Exactly. So to start mapping that collapse, we can't just talk in abstractions. We need to anchor this in a real human story. The first part of our discussion is built around an account I found in our research that, it just stopped me in my tracks.
Okay.
I want you to picture a man named Thomas. He's a retired civil servant, lives in a small town in the English Midlands, and for his entire adult life, for 40 years, Thomas was the system. He was the status quo, in the best sense of the word.
He believed in the institutions.
Believed in them. He was them. The local council meetings, the library board, organizing the schedule for the community hall. This wasn't just a job or a hobby for him. It was, the entire framework of his life, the rhythm. But he told a local journalist recently that his town now feels weightless.
Weightless. That's a powerful word.
Isn't it? And he means it literally. The council he served on is basically bankrupt. The library he so carefully curated, the one with the good roof and the functioning windows, it was sold off. It's a private gym now. The community hall is padlocked. And Thomas, he actually used a very specific word to describe how he feels. He said he's experiencing anomie. It's this deep sense of social drift. The old rules are gone, but no new ones have shown up to replace them.
He's floating. The anchors are gone.
Completely. And he sees it all around him. He watches his neighbors, people he's known his whole life, retreating into these really extreme corners. Some are demanding a total teardown of everything, like the young man at the library meeting. Others are desperate for a return to some, imagine 1950s paradise.
And Thomas is stuck in the middle of that void.
He is the void. The center he represented, it didn't just get weaker, it dissolved, it evaporated. And listening to him, you realize he isn't just mourning a building or a budget cut. He's mourning a whole way of being. He's mourning the social glue.
And as an observer, you have to feel that this story, Thomas's story, is not unique. It's playing out everywhere. When those core institutions lose their legitimacy, their gravity, people get scared. And scared people reach for simple, powerful certainties.
It's a human reaction. You want to feel solid ground under your feet.
Sure.
And if the system can't provide it, you'll find someone or something that promises to.
The fact that Thomas himself used the word anomie is incredible. It's a very precise, very technical term from sociology. You don't usually hear it outside of a university seminar.
No, you don't. He used it very deliberately. And I want to dig into that because it's so much more than just a synonym for chaos or confusion. For Thomas, it's a physical sensation. It's the weightlessness.
It is. The concept really comes from Émile Durkheim, the French sociologist. And to understand it, you have to remember when he was writing the late 1800s, early 1900s, he was living through a period of massive, earth-shattering change.
The Industrial Revolution.
Exactly. The shift from a rural, traditional society to an urban, industrial one. It was just as disruptive then as our digital revolution is today. And Durkheim was trying to figure out what holds a society together when all the old bonds family, village, church are being weakened.
So what did he mean by anomie specifically? You said it's not just chaos.
He defined it as a state of normlessness. It's not necessarily about riots in the streets, though that can happen. It's a breakdown in the collective consciousness.
The shared understanding of how the world works.
Precisely. In a healthy society, Durkheim argued, there are shared norms. A shared moral framework that regulates our desires. It tells you what's okay to want, what's a legitimate way to achieve it, and what your obligations are to other people. Anomie is when those rules lose their power. They stop feeling real.
So it's like everyone is playing a game, but half the players think they're playing chess and the other half think they're playing checkers, and the rule book is on fire.
That's a fantastic analogy. And Durkheim's insight was that human desires, left to their own devices, are basically infinite. We always want more status, more wealth, more everything. The social structure is supposed to be the thing that says, okay, this is enough, or this is the proper way to strive. Without that structure, we're just adrift in a sea of insatiable wants.
Which sounds miserable. A recipe for constant frustration.
He linked it directly to suicide rates. He did this famous study where he showed that suicide rates weren't just a matter of individual psychology. They spiked during times of both economic busts and sudden economic booms.
Wait, booms too? That seems counterintuitive.
It does, but it makes perfect sense in his framework. In a sudden boom, all the old limits are gone. The rules about what you can achieve are suddenly thrown out the window. People get disoriented. Their expectations become limitless, and so does their potential for disappointment. It's that same weightlessness Thomas feels. The norms that regulated life are suddenly gone.
Okay, that clarifies things. Now, in the research, there's a distinction made between Durkheim's idea of anomie and a later one from Robert Merton. How do they differ?
Right, so Merton, an American sociologist, adapted the concept in the mid-20th century. For Merton, anomie was less about a total collapse of norms and more about a specific mismatch, a gap between socially approved goals and the available means to achieve them.
The classic example being the American dream, right?
Mm-hmm. That's the one. Society tells you the goal is to be wealthy and successful. That's plastered everywhere. But for many people, the legitimate means to get there, a good education, a high-paying job, are blocked. That creates a huge strain.
And that strain, that's Merton's anomie. It pushes people to find other, less legitimate means. Crime, for instance.
Exactly. So Merton's anomie is more of a tension within the system. But what Thomas is feeling, the total dissolution of the library and the council, that feels much closer to Durkheim's original, more catastrophic definition. It's not a strain in the system, it's the collapse of the system itself.
Right, the very structure is gone. But there's another layer here, a more modern one, from a paper by Meshcherkova and Vasilenko. They talk about something called reflexive anomie. That feels important.
It is, because it brings this century-old concept right into our current moment. The key difference is between structural and reflexive.
Structural is the external stuff we've been talking about. An economic crisis, a war, globalization, hollowing out of town.
Yes. It's a response to a clear external pressure on the social system. Reflexive anomie, on the other hand, is internal. It's subjective. It's about how we as individuals process a world that is fundamentally uncertain.
What do you mean by subjective?
Think about Thomas's world in, say, 1980. The decision-making center was outside of him. It was in the institutions. The council had its procedures. The library had its rules. Society had its traditions. You knew your place, and you knew the path.
The map was provided for you.
The map was provided. But now, as those institutions fail, the burden of decision-making, the burden of creating meaning, shifts from the society down to the individual, to the micro level.
So every single person is now responsible for drawing their own map, for inventing their own reality from scratch.
And that is an unbelievably heavy cognitive and psychological load. We are not really built for that. We're left to navigate this hyper-complex, uncertain world with only our own internal compass, and that compass might be spinning wildly.
And this leads to what the paper calls nonlinear reactions.
Exactly. Because there's no shared social script, people's reactions become radically unpredictable. Faced with the same uncertainty, one person retreats into isolation and depression. Another becomes a wellness influencer. A third joins an extremist political movement. There's no coherent, predictable response anymore.
That's reflexive anomie. The instability isn't just coming from the outside world, it's coming from the fact that we're all improvising our own realities all at once, bouncing off each other.
It perfectly captures that sense of unreality so many people feel, and it explains why Thomas sees his neighbors flying off to the extremes. When you have to build your own reality, you're going to be one that feels secure, that gives you a sense of identity and purpose, even if it looks completely bizarre to everyone else.
Okay, so that's the what. We have a name for this feeling of weightlessness and the unpredictable behavior it creates. But I want to get to the why. Why is the center collapsing now with such speed? And for that, we have this study on modeling the emergence of affective polarization.
Yes, this one is fascinating. It uses agent-based modeling, basically creating a simulated society in a computer to see how polarization happens.
And the key finding is that this isn't just about people having different opinions anymore. It's about what they call affective polarization.
Which is a huge distinction. Affective polarization is when your political party or ideology stops being a set of policy preferences and becomes a core part of your social identity. It's no longer, I disagree with your stance on tax policy. It's, you are a bad person and people like you are the enemy. It's tribal.
It's personal. And the model in this study argues that technology is the main driver, but not in the way we usually talk about it, not just the algorithm is feeding us outrage.
No, it's more fundamental than that. It's about something they call search costs.
Right. Explain that.
Okay, think about Thomas's town again, 30 or 40 years ago. The cost of searching for interaction was very high. Your interactions were limited by geography. You had to talk to your next-door neighbor, even if they supported the opposite political party. You had to interact with the people at your job, at the grocery store, in your church.
You couldn't just curate a social circle of people who were 100% identical to you.
It was impossible. And this, perhaps accidentally, enforced something sociologists call contact theory. The theory is that prejudice and hostility decrease when members of different groups are forced to interact with each other on a regular basis. You're forced to see the humanity in people you disagree with because, well, you have to see them every day.
The cost of searching for a perfectly homogenous group was too high. You were stuck with your neighbor.
You were. But modern technology, the internet, social media, crashes those search costs down to basically zero. You no longer have to talk to your annoying neighbor. You can instantly go online and find a global community of people who share your exact niche interest, your exact grievance, your exact worldview.
You can connect based on a shared identity, not a shared zip code.
Precisely. And the model shows that this creates two fundamentally different types of social organization or regimes.
The fluid regime and the solid regime.
The fluid regime is the world Thomas remembers, a world of high search costs. In that world, identities are relatively weak and flexible. Your political affiliation is one part of you, not your entire being. And your social connections are heterogeneous. You know a lot of different kinds of people.
And the solid regime.
That's the world of low search costs.
Yeah.
That's our world. Identities become powerful, rigid, all-encompassing, and connections become homogenous. You mostly, or exclusively, interact with your tribe. The liberals talk to liberals, the conservatives talk to conservatives.
And the model shows that lowering search costs is the switch that flips the society from fluid to solid.
It's the key variable. It changes the entire topology of how we interact.
But here's the part of that study that really gave me a chill. The concept of hysteresis. It's a word from physics, right?
It is. Hysteresis is the idea that the state of a system depends on its history. The classic example is a magnet. It takes a certain amount of energy to magnetize a piece of iron. But once it's magnetized, it doesn't take that same amount of energy in the opposite direction to demagnetize it. It holds on to some of its magnetic property. The path back is different from the path there.
The system has a memory.
The system has a memory. And in the context of this polarization model, it means you can't just easily reverse the process.
So you're saying that even if we, turned off the internet tomorrow, or if we somehow forced everyone to go to town hall meetings with their neighbors again.
The model suggests it wouldn't be enough to fix the problem. The system has crossed a tipping point. The identities have already been formed and have hardened. The social connections have already been rewired. The study found that even if you raise the search costs back up, the strong, homogeneous identity groups would likely persist.
The system is locked in to the polarized state.
It's locked in. It's a one-way street, or at least the road back is much, much harder and steeper than the road that got us here.
That's terrifying. It means Thomas's grief it's not just nostalgia. He's right. The middle ground he lived in might be structurally impossible to rebuild in the same way, because the very physics of how we connect with each other has permanently changed.
It explains the weightlessness. The center can't hold because the entire structure has been reconfigured to strengthen the edges, which of course raises the next question. When the center collapses and the old institutions lose their authority, what rushes in to fill that power vacuum?
Well, according to our next source, the answer is the self. We turn inward. And this brings us to a really troubling account from inside one of the institutions that is supposed to be a guardian of our culture and our standards. A very prestigious New England university. I was reading a series of blog posts by a former department head. She remains anonymous for obvious reasons, but she described a profound cultural shift that she witnessed over her career. A shift away from what you might call traditional reform towards what she explicitly called a culture of narcissism.
That's a loaded term. What did she mean by it in practice?
She gave a specific example, a promotion committee meeting. And she said it became clear that the criteria were no longer primarily about academic merit, the quality of your research, your teaching evaluations, the traditional stuff. Instead, the person who was most likely to get ahead was the person who could craft the most compelling narrative of their own personal trauma or therapeutic need.
So competence takes a backseat to a story of suffering.
Exactly. The institution, in her view, had stopped functioning like a university and started functioning like a clinic. Its main purpose seemed to be providing emotional validation rather than upholding functional standards.
She called it the therapeutic state.
Yes. And her fear was that this isn't just a change in culture. It's a form of institutional decay. It breaks the entire machine of meritocracy. If the loudest I and the most compelling story of victimhood always wins, you're no longer promoting the people who can actually build the future or discover new knowledge.
You're just managing feelings.
You're managing feelings. And her argument is that this is profoundly dangerous. When an entire society or its key institutions start acting like a giant therapy session, you lose the very standards that make a civilization work.
That phrase, the culture of narcissism, comes directly from the work of Christopher Lasch. And just like with anomie, it's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but he meant something very specific by it.
Right. When I hear narcissism, my first thought is just vanity, someone who loves looking in the mirror. But that wasn't Lasch's point, was it?
Not at all. He wasn't talking about simple selfishness or arrogance. He was using the clinical definition of pathological narcissism. And the great irony is that the pathological narcissist doesn't have a strong self. They have an incredibly weak, fragile, and empty self.
So they need constant external validation.
Constant. Endless. They have no internal core, no stable sense of who they are. So they need the outside world to be a mirror, constantly reflecting back an image of themselves just so they can feel real. Their whole life becomes a performance for an audience.
And if we apply that to the department head's story, if the university starts rewarding that behavior, it's essentially telling people, your value here comes not from your work, but from your professed weakness, from your need for our validation.
Precisely. And that's how you get the therapeutic state. Lash argued that historically you would get your sense of self and emotional support from your family, your community, your religion. The state and the workplace were for other things, for law, for production.
A separation of spheres.
Yes. The therapeutic state emerges when institutions like the university or the government or the corporation start taking over the role of the family. They become the primary source of validation and meaning. And because the narcissistic personality needs that constant feedback, they become incredibly dependent on these large impersonal bureaucracies.
It creates a really perverse set of incentives, doesn't it? If I'm a young academic in that department, my best career strategy isn't to write a groundbreaking paper. It's to publicly perform my vulnerability and appeal to the institution to heal me.
You're incentivized to be a patient, not a scholar. And this connects directly to another concept from our sources, medicalization. And this is work from people like Peter Conrad and Ivan Illich.
Medicalization is when we redefine normal human problems as medical conditions.
Exactly. The sources give classic examples. A shy person doesn't just have a personality trait. They have social anxiety disorder. A boisterous, energetic child doesn't just need to run around more. They have ADHD.
We reframe everything in the language of medicine and therapy.
And Ivan Illich had a really sharp critique of this. He called it iatrogenesis, which means illness caused by medical treatment. He argued that when you medicalize all of life's struggles, you actually harm people by making them passive. You teach them that they can't cope with life on their own. They always need an expert, a professional, a therapist to manage their existence.
Which brings us right back to the department head. If every challenge, every disagreement, every failure is framed as a therapeutic issue, it gets removed from the world of normal judgment. You can't criticize a symptom. You can only treat it. You can't hold someone to a standard if their failure to meet it is just a sign of their trauma.
It creates total paralysis. You can't make judgments about quality or competence anymore because to do so would be unempathetic or even cruel. And Lash saw this as part of a bigger, more dangerous trend, which he wrote about in another book, The Revolt of the Elites.
We always hear about the revolt of the masses, the populist uprising. What did he mean by a revolt of the elites?
He argued that the new elites, say the top 20% by income and education, are fundamentally different from the old ruling classes, the old bourgeoisie. The old elites, for all their faults, were at least rooted in their communities. They lived in the towns where their factories were. They felt some, even if it was self-serving, sense of civic duty.
But the new elites...
The new elites, he said, have withdrawn from common life. They've become tourists in their own countries. They live in a globalized world of airports and conferences, and their loyalty is to their professional class, not to their fellow citizens.
And they insulate themselves. Private schools, gated communities, or voluntary ghettos, as he called them, private security. They opt out of the public square entirely.
They do. And the betrayal, in Lash's view, is that this new elite class controls the culture. They run the universities, the media, the foundations, like the university in our story. But they've abandoned the basic obligations of citizenship that should come with that power. They're focused on their own self-improvement, their lifestyle, their therapeutic well-being, not on public service.
Which is the core of the department head's frustration. The very institution that should be a pillar of civic life has turned inward and become a temple for self-exploration for a privileged few.
It becomes a closed loop, and it leaves everyone else feeling abandoned.
Which is the perfect transition. Because if the center has dissolved into anomie and the elites have retreated into a therapeutic bubble, what happens to the ordinary people who were just left behind, trying to make sense of it all?
They start to crave order, any kind of order.
And that brings us to our third narrative anchor. I want to tell you about Clara. She's an elderly woman living in a suburb of Paris that has changed dramatically in her lifetime. Her story was part of a documentary I watched.
Okay.
And for decades, Clara's world was defined by what the sociologists would call organic social ties. It was the little things. The butcher who knew her cut of meat, the woman at the market stall she'd gossip with, the shared routines of the neighborhood. That was her reality.
A dense web of small, familiar interactions.
Exactly. But over the last 20 years, those ties have just snapped. Huge demographic shifts, economic changes. The butcher shop is now a mobile phone store. The market has completely different vendors, different languages. The familiar faces are gone.
Her social world has been deconstructed around her.
Completely. And the crucial point about Clara is that she's not some political ideologue. The documentary makes it clear she's not a reactionary in the sense of wanting to overthrow the government and install a king. What she wants is what she called a clinical restoration of common sense.
Clinical restoration. That's a fascinating phrase.
Isn't it? She feels that basic civilizational standards, politeness, cleanliness, a shared sense of public order have been actively taken apart, and she just wants someone to put them back together. She's not looking for a grand new ideology. She's looking for the familiar.
It's easy to dismiss that as just an old person being afraid of change.
Very easy. But I think it's deeper. It's a functionalist cry for help. When the social ties break down that completely, people stop being interested in abstract ideas like progress. They just want restoration. They want a world that makes sense again.
And what Clara is mourning is, again, something Durkheim read about extensively. She's mourning the loss of a particular kind of solidarity.
We have to go back to Durkheim.
We always go back to Durkheim. He made a vital distinction between two types of social solidarity, mechanical and organic.
Mechanical is the old-fashioned kind, right?
Yeah.
The kind you'd find in a traditional village.
Yes. Mechanical solidarity is based on sameness. The social glue works because everyone is basically the same. We have the same beliefs, the same values, the same work, the same daily life. We are held together by our shared collective consciousness.
That's Clara's world. The butcher, the market, the shared reality.
That's the world she's lost. Organic solidarity, on the other hand, is what's supposed to hold modern, complex societies together. It's not based on sameness, it's based on interdependence.
Because of the high division of labor.
Exactly. I'm a podcaster, you're an expert, neither of us knows how to grow food or build a house.
Sure.
We rely on each other because we are different and specialized. The farmer needs the doctor needs the engineer needs the teacher. That interdependence is meant to be the new social glue.
So what's the problem? Modern society is supposed to be held together by this organic solidarity, but it feels like it's falling apart.
Well, this is where it all connects. Organic solidarity has one critical, non-negotiable prerequisite: trust. You have to trust that the strangers you depend on are competent and are playing by the same set of rules. You have to trust the institutions that regulate all this complexity.
And what happens when that trust evaporates, as Thomas saw with the collapse of his local council?
When trust breaks down, organic solidarity fails. And when it fails, people don't just float in a void. They desperately try to retreat back to what feels safe. They retreat to mechanical solidarity. They look for their tribe. They search for pockets of sameness in a world that feels dangerously different.
So, connecting this back to the modeling study, the technology that lowers our search costs is the perfect tool for doing this. It allows us to find and create digital villages, pockets of mechanical solidarity.
Exactly. One of the sources explicitly mentions movements like QAnon as modern attempts to create a powerful, all-encompassing pocket of mechanical solidarity. A tribe with a shared, secret reality set against a confusing and untrustworthy outside world.
So Clara's longing for the butcher isn't just nostalgia. It's a desire for the safety of mechanical solidarity in a world where organic solidarity feels like a lie.
It is, but we have to talk about the extreme consequences. What happens when both forms of solidarity fail a person completely? When the organic ties are broken and they can't find or fail to create a mechanical tribe to belong to?
This is where we have to discuss the analysis in the new social development source regarding the cases of Anders Breivik in Norway and Stephen Paddock, the Las Vegas shooter.
These cases were so baffling to people because they broke the usual molds. These weren't men who were poor or uneducated or from classically oppressed groups. Paddock was a wealthy, successful accountant. Breivik was from a comfortable middle-class background.
There was no obvious structural reason for their actions.
No. And the diagnosis offered in the research is that they represent the absolute final stage of that reflexive anomie we discussed earlier. This wasn't anomie caused by poverty or systemic injustice. This was a purely internal collapse, a total failure to construct a meaningful self in a meaningless world.
And it connects back to narcissism.
Directly. The source quotes a line: "Invisibility is the narcissist's nightmare." When you have that fragile, empty self that requires constant external validation, the one thing you cannot tolerate is being ignored.
And in a world of infinite noise, the ultimate way to get attention, to force the world to see you,
is an act of spectacular violence. It becomes a horrific way to scream, "I exist," to force the world, finally, to acknowledge the I.
So if we trace the path, the broad, organic ties of trust fail. The therapeutic state, with its promise of validation, fails to provide real meaning. The person is left utterly alone in a void. For most people, like Clara, this leads to a quiet, desperate desire for order,
But for a tiny, unstable few, it leads to a desire for total destruction, an act of violent self-creation against a world they feel has erased them.
This paints a pretty bleak picture. Let's try to pull all these threads together now and synthesize this. Let's go back to that town hall meeting, to the library. How does this map of anomie, narcissism, and solidarity help us understand what was happening in that room?
Okay, let's look at the players. First, you have the young man with the flyers, the revolutionary. He sees the library not as a fixable problem, but as a symbol of a dead, rotten system. He embodies that drive to wipe the slate clean.
He's on the far left of our spectrum. Revolution and reform.
Yes, but it's a specific kind. As the department head's story warns us, when that revolutionary impulse is unmoored from objective standards, when it becomes all about deconstruction for its own sake, it can easily slide into a kind of collective narcissism. The goal becomes the therapeutic act of tearing down rather than the hard work of building something better.
Then you have the older woman with the black and white photograph, Claire.
Exactly. She represents the other pole, the conservative, and in her case, the reactionary. She sees the loss of the social glue, the decay of standards. She's desperate for a restoration of that lost world of mechanical solidarity.
The danger being, of course, that her fast car to the past, as the source material calls it, can't actually take her there. The world has changed. You can't just rebuild the 1920s.
You can't. And in the middle, you have the most hated man in the room, the contractor.
The status quo. The man who just wants to fix the HVAC.
He represents the functional center. He's not interested in ideology. He's interested in making the building work. He is the embodiment of what Thomas, the civil servant, spent his life doing, maintaining the system, fixing the roof, keeping the windows from leaking.
And he's suffering from the consequences of anomie. The very system he's trying to serve has become weightless, meaningless to the people on the extremes. He's trying to apply a practical solution in a room where the argument is actually about metaphysics.
He's become the enemy because he represents a compromise with a reality that both sides have rejected.
So if we look at the whole journey of this deep dive, we started with the physical structural collapse of the center, with Thomas and the model that showed us how our social world is being physically rewired by technology, creating a state of hysteresis where the middle can't hold.
Then we moved inward, to the psychological consequences, to the department head's story of the therapeutic state and the culture of narcissism, where the self, not society, becomes the ultimate project.
And finally, we saw the reaction to all of this. Clara's desperate craving for external order, for the restoration of common sense and the safety of mechanical solidarity. A craving that, in its most extreme form, can curdle into something truly destructive.
So that invisible architecture you talked about at the beginning, it seems to be shifting. We are moving away from a structure built on geography, compromise, and institutional trust, and toward a new architecture built on digital identity, psychological validation, and tribal solidarity.
We often think of political polarization as a fight over the future, but perhaps it's actually a fight over reality itself. When the public square dissolves, we don't just lose our neighbors, we lose the mirror that tells us who we are. We are replacing communities with diagnoses and citizens with patients, leaving us with a society that is endlessly treating its symptoms while the foundation quietly rots away.